Holy Gospel according to Luke, the 20th chapter.
Glory to you, O Lord.
Some Sadducees, those who say there is no resurrection, came to Jesus and asked him a question. Teacher, Moses wrote for us that if a man's brother dies, leaving a wife but no children, the man shall marry the widow and raise up children for his brother. Now there were 7 brothers. The first married and died childless. Then the second and the third married her, and so in the same way all 7 died childless. Finally, the woman also died. In the resurrection, therefore, whose wife will the woman be? For the 7 had married her. Jesus said to them, those who belong to this age marry and are given in marriage, but those who are considered worthy of a place in that age and in the resurrection from the dead neither marry nor are given in marriage. Indeed, they cannot die anymore, because they are like angels and are children of God, being children of the resurrection. And the fact that the dead are raised, Moses himself showed in the story about the bush, where he speaks of the Lord as the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. Now he is God not of the dead, but of the living, for to him all of them are alive. The gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, O Christ.
You may be seated. All Saints Sunday seems like it could be kind of a strange day to hear a story about Sadducees coming and asking questions about the resurrection, setting a trap for Jesus, if you will. Even more bizarre to 21st century ears, maybe, or sensibilities, is the notion of levirate marriage. Levirate marriage is that ancient practice that calls for the brother of a deceased man who died childless to marry the widow and produce children by that widow, so that the family name gets carried on, so that there are heirs. Now the Sadducees came to push the issue to the absurd, to show, at least in their minds, that resurrection is crazy talk. This is all so strange to our modern ears. But before getting too deeply into the reality of this story and what it speaks to us today, it may be helpful to catch up a bit. The set readings for the church year made a massive leap from last Sunday to today. For the past 4 months, the church has been hearing the story of Jesus, who has set his face toward Jerusalem and has been slowly making his way to Jerusalem and encountering different people. And in the midst of that, has been addressing a variety of concerns and teaching and showing people what the reign of God looks like. Indeed, the church has been on this journey with Jesus for a long time. Last Sunday, Jesus was passing through Jericho, a town 12 or 15 miles to the east and north of Jerusalem. And indeed, there he met a tax collector, a sinner, Zacchaeus. And he informed Zacchaeus, that tax collector, that sinner, that he was coming to dine with him that evening. And in that moment, we saw as the people of God that we don't have to climb up to God, but rather God comes to us and meets us where we are and walks with us. From there to today, a great deal has happened. In fact, Jesus is now in this epic conflict that is building to the end. Jesus has entered into Jerusalem. We commemorate that entry into Jerusalem each Palm Sunday when we celebrate his entry. And when he arrived there, he went into the temple and he shook things up. He confronted the money changers and those who were selling sacrificial animals. He started to challenge the way that everything was being done. He had taken up a teaching position, and people were asking questions. By what authority do you teach like this? All of this is a direct threat to the people who have authority for making sure that things are done in the right way at the temple. And those people are the Sadducees. What's more, the Sadducees are a group who really only acknowledge the Pentateuch, those first 5 books of the Bible, as having authority. So they don't believe in the resurrection. And they hold, they want to make sure that they get the rules right. Now, Jesus' behavior has nudged those Sadducees into a closer and closer relationship, at least for the sake of dealing with Jesus, with another group that they typically have some conflict with. That group is the Pharisees. It's kind of one of those deals where if your enemy is my enemy, then maybe we can be allies, at least for this situation. And so the Sadducees come to Jesus to ask a question that pushes everything to the absurd. Now, last week I spoke about John Haut's sense that theology needs to reorient a bit. That as we think about who God is and what God is doing, the tendency has been to look back or to dig deep, if you will. And in looking back, we tend to try to find the real, the pristine version of what is godly and what is God's best creation. To go back to that very beginning and say, that's it. If we could only get back there, then everything would be great. Or to buy into a notion that somehow if we can just look up, climb up, move up into a space that is closer to God, we can get there. But what John Haut is arguing is that indeed God's best creation is still in process and is coming. And so instead of orienting towards the past or orienting upward, we should be orienting towards the future, where we watch for what is unfolding and the ways that God's grace is coming into being, looking for new ways that God is acting. Now, in response to the Sadducees, Jesus points to the way. That humanity has a tendency, when we encounter something that we don't quite recognize, we go back to that past, to those things that we have seen, those things that we have experienced, and we try to make sense of it in light of those. The problem with that is it doesn't allow a lot of space for possibilities that are emerging. It does not allow room for new ways of seeing and experiencing and being in relationship with creation and with God. And so when Jesus points to these human metaphors for heaven and for the future, Well, those are still so terribly grounded in our past, in what has been. As a side note, it is one of the great challenges for congregations that are engaging strategic planning. Because too often, congregations and individual members of congregations have a hard time imagining a new way of being and doing church. And so what congregations do is we reach back to those glory days when everything was perfect. And we try to recreate those. It's hard work to open ourselves up individually and as a community to what God is unfolding right before us in an emerging new future. So when Jesus responds to those Sadducees, he says, first, you don't understand what the resurrection is, what the resurrection will look like. There won't be marrying and relationship in the way that you have understood it. In fact, all the old rules and principles will kind of go away. I heard a rabbi speaking about the death penalty this past week, and he said, applying those ancient laws of Torah literally does not make sense in the 21st century. Being too literal about these metaphors gets us in trouble. The resurrection will be a whole new way of being, and in this whole new way of being, death will no longer exist. The children of God can no longer die. Many theologians remind us that the scriptures are full of images, metaphors for what God's reign looks like right now and in that emerging future. The challenge with metaphor is that anytime you push a metaphor too far, it starts to fall apart. The faithful people of God cannot presume that those images, those metaphors are literally true. Those metaphors are signs. They point to a larger truth, a bigger and more beautiful thing than anything we can imagine. The promise is that God is a God of the living. For those of us in the Christian tradition, we understand that we enter into the fullness of God's love for us through the waters of our baptism, where God claims us as God's own child, where God promises to accompany us. And within the Christian tradition, we know that indeed our baptism is not complete until that time when we die and we enter into the promises of the resurrection. The Sadducees and many today misapprehend what living into that resurrection really means. It is bigger and brighter and so much more beautiful than we have envisioned using what we know in this life and in our experience. Jesus calls us to look forward to an emerging reality, grounded in the promises of a creation that is still unfolding. Jesus calls us to trust that this new life is a place where death is no more. And so today, we remember the promises of God's reign come near in Jesus Christ. We remember those promises even as remember the people who have been a part of our lives, who have been faithful, and who have died this past year. We remember those promises even as we remember the people who have died longer ago, whom we have loved and who have shown us what it is to live faithfully. We remember all the saints who from their labor rest. And we orient ourselves to the promises that God offers through Jesus Christ, the living God.